Hey, how's it going? It's Dan from modular.dev, and today we're going to go over some Blazor things. We're going to go over the Blazor component lifecycle and the initialization step, the on parameters set, the render, that kind of stuff. And we're going to talk about disposing your objects as well. So if you haven't been here before, definitely feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go through. If you're watching afterwards, go ahead and ask them in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you. And as always, like and subscribe to the channel if you liked the video. So let's go ahead and get started. So I've linked this in the description. This is the ASP.NET Core Blazor Lifecycle official documentation, and you can read through that on your own. And basically, we're going to go over kind of what it goes into depth on this document. We're going to go into it today. So I've created a brand new Blazor WebAssembly app, and if we run it here, we'll notice that it's pretty standard stuff. We got the counter component and the home page and the weather forecast. So if you ever run a Blazor app before, you're familiar with this for sure. Looks like for some reason that's failing, but that's okay. We're gonna be staying in the counter component. And we're going to be talking about the life cycle here. So the first thing I would do if you're new to Blazor, if you're not familiar with the options that you have here, I would just type in protected override here and just kind of see what options you have. So if you notice, we've got 7 options: on after render async, on initialized async, on parameters set async, and should render. So those are the 7 things you can override for your components, and each one of those has its, with the exception of should render, has its pair of things, right? We've got a regular version and then we have an async version. So when you'd want to use an async version is if you have an asynchronous task, like maybe you're making an HTTP call to something and waiting for that response. In those cases, you're going to want to use the async one, because you might want to wait for that response. But in this example, I don't want to get too in-depth with that kind of thing, so we're just going to go ahead and just do a regular on initialized, on parameters set, and on after render. But go ahead and use the async versions if that's what you need. So let's go ahead. And for whatever reason, IntelliSense doesn't work that great. I tried clicking it, and it kind of fails the first time, and the second time it works. So maybe your Visual Studio is better at that than mine, or maybe that's some known issue that they're going to fix. But either way, let's go ahead and, oh, I guess I got the async version. I'll just change it back to the other one. So on initialized, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write something to the console just so we can see in what order these get called, because that's important too, right? We have 3 that we're mainly concerned about, which is the on initialized, on parameters set, and on after render, and I'm curious to know which ones get run first, second, and third. So let's go ahead and put on initialized for counter page, or counter component I should say, because we don't know for sure if it's a page. Alright, let's go ahead and add another one for on after render, and this one takes a parameter for first time. So if you didn't know that, you could again type in protected, and then you could see your different choices. On after render and on after render async take a parameter bool first render. So that can be important for some first time setup things. For example, if you need to hook up some JavaScript, you may want to do it there, only on the first time. So take advantage of that if you need it. Let's go ahead and change this to on after render. And the last one is on parameters set. All right, on parameters set for counter component. So if we just run this now, we should see all 3 of these happen. And I've already kind of organized them in the way that they're going to work, but you know, let's just mix it up just to be dangerous. you'll notice that it doesn't matter what order I actually declare these in. The onInitialize is going to get called first, then parameters set, then onAfterRender. Also, you know what I want to do? I want to say first time, and then I want to put out the first time variable so that we know if it's the first time or not. All right, let's go ahead and run this. And I'm going to open up the console. And I'm going to switch to the counter component. And if you notice now we have 3 messages in here. The first one is onInitialized for counter component, onParameters set for counter component, and onAfterRender for counter component. And we set first time is true. So what do these things actually do? The onInitialize is what's going to get called right when your component is basically created. That's the first thing that's going to get called. OnParameters set is going to get called immediately after that, and any other time that your parameters are set on your component. So for example, this component doesn't have any parameters, but in just a second I'll make a component that has parameters, and you can see how this is going to get set during the lifetime of the component, not just at the beginning. And lastly, we have onAfterRender, which gets called the first time immediately after onParameters set. Well, let me back up. OnParameters set gets called, then the component gets rendered, and then this gets called onAfterRender. So, and then any subsequent times the component renders, this will be run as well with first time set to false. Alright, so let's go ahead and create another component now. I want to have the option to basically open up a modal here if they want to increment the counter by more than 1. So right now, if I, in the standard Blazor application, if I click it, the counter is going to go up for each time I click it, which is fine. But maybe I want it to go up by some different amount, in which case I'm going to allow them to type in that amount. So I'm just going to create another button here, open modal, and on the click, I'm going to do something. I don't know what yet. Let's go ahead and create the modal component, and then we'll fill in that on click later. All right, counter modal.razor. So we're going to put a code block at the top here, and for a parameter, what do I want to happen when the modal is closed? I want to pass back to the caller, which is this counter, how much it should increment by. Because what I eventually want to have happen is a modal with a text box, or a number box rather, that when I hit OK, it sends that number back to the caller, and we increment the counter by that amount. So I'm going to use a callback here using an action int. I'm just going to call it callback. So parameters are things that you can pass to the component, and we will pass something to this component in just a second. But let's go ahead and fill out the rest of this component for now, and then we'll fill in the parameter. So I'm going to create a div for my modal, and I'm going to give it some inline styles. Normally you wouldn't use inline styles, but just for sake of time and clarity, I'm just going to do it here. So we want to have a background on this modal to maybe transparent black, and we want it to be positioned on top of the screen, and we want it to be we want the backdrop to be 100% width and 100% height, and we want it to be positioned at the top and at the left. And just in case there's anything else, we're going to put the Z index at 1,000 just to kind of put it up in the forefront. Okay, that's the backdrop for the modal. For the modal itself, let's put another div inside here. And again, divs probably isn't the best way to do it, but we're just doing it for sake of doing it here. Let's go ahead and put a white background on the actual modal itself. And we'll give it a width of 500 pixels. Let's do 600 pixels, a height of 600 pixels, and let's position it at right in the center of the screen. So 50% minus 300 pixels, which is it's 50% from the top and then minus half of itself, and then also from the left. What's going on here? Oh, I didn't mean to put that quote there. Okay, so I think that's our modal. I maybe forgot something, but we'll fill it in if we need to. Oh, I want to put a little bit of a padding on it. Okay, so let's put a h2, I guess. And how much do you want to increment by? And then we'll put a input type of number, and we'll give it we'll bind a value to it so that we can get the value back from it. So I need to create a variable actually to use. So int increment by, and we'll just set it to 0 for the initial value, and then we'll put increment by here. And this will all get back to the component lifecycles in just a second. I just want to set this up. So we got a number, and we want to have a button that when it is clicked, it's going to call that callback with the increment by. So update number. So what is this all going to do? We have a number that we're putting in, and we've got a button that's when it's clicked, it's going to call back this parameter to the calling screen. So we haven't filled in that parameter yet, but essentially what we want to have happen is when this callback gets executed, the modal closes, and the number that's passed by will be put into the current count. So let's go ahead and create an open modal method. Private void open modal. Okay, we need some kind of variable to determine if our modal is open or not. Let's go ahead and put bool modal open, and by default it'll be false. So we'll set modal open to true, and I guess that's about it. So we have a couple different options of how we can do it. We can do if modal open, then we have a component, a counter modal, and then we give it a callback, and in this callback we can put a number, and we'll increment current count. Why are you being like that? I think it's just confused right now. Plus equals num. Okay, so yeah, I guess that's fine. What are we getting? Some kind of error. All right, I'll just put it in let's put it in one of these. Okay, so when the modal is opened, on callback, we're going to increment the current count. So let's just see if that works, first of all, and we'll talk about it after it's done. Let's go ahead and start the debugger, or start without debugging, rather. Go to the counter and open this modal. And we've got this up here in the wrong spot. Let's see. Oh, I forgot to put position absolute on that. We'll go ahead and fix that in the next time we come up to it. But yeah, so let's update this number here. We'll put a 3, hit update number. And if you notice, nothing happens, or nothing at least appears to happen. So why is that? The problem is that the component that we're currently updating, or we're currently calling this callback, is actually in the counter modal. We're doing callback increment by, and so that the callback is nothing more than a function, right? So we're actually calling this function inside this component, which is fine, but the problem is this component doesn't know that it needs to re-render itself. So this is all, and again, related to the component lifecycle, because we need to trigger the render step. And to do that, you can do StateHasChanged, and this will trigger the render step. Now, after that happens, you'll notice we'll get some more messages in the console on the on-after render step because we have changed its state and had to re-render it. So let's go ahead and try it again. I don't think I have to keep clicking that, but that's okay. Okay, yeah, I still forgot to put it in the middle of the page, but that's okay. 5. Okay, what is going on? Let's see. All right, we are still getting this on after render for counter component, and we forgot to set modal open back to false. That's what it was. All right, let's try that again. And you know what? That's gonna bug me. I just want to move that into the center right now. Position absolute on that modal. Okay, let's try that again. All right, so now it's in the center. We hit 5, and boom, we got this updated because we called StateHasChanged. If we look in the console, we've got on after render for counter component, first time false. And if you notice, this has actually happened twice. So we've actually rendered this counter component a total of 3 times. First time, and then 2 more times. So what happens is when we set the variable to open the modal to true and render the modal, it's actually rendering the counter component. Look at that. So it's rendering it there, and then it's also rendering it here. So it's actually rendering it 2 times every time we do this, which is fine. However, the problem becomes if you have a whole lot of code in your on after render. Maybe you've got, you know, some HTTP calls, or maybe you've got some, I don't know, some really heavy stuff in there. You got to be careful about on after render because that might get called a lot. So just kind of be aware of that. And as you notice, we've still only seen the on parameters set get called once. So let's go ahead and kind of take all 3 of these and put them into the modal so we can see when they are called in the modal too. And I guess for now, I'm just going to delete. Yeah, I'll just delete these so we're not getting too many messages in the console. And let's go ahead and change this to counter modal, just so there's no confusion there. Okay, so let's go ahead and run it. And open up the console. So when we first get there, we see nothing, which is actually good to know because on the counter component, we have this counter modal, but it's only getting rendered if open modal is true. So if open modal is not true, like it is in its current state, it doesn't even hit the on initialized and on the on parameter set and on the on after render methods. None of this happens. In fact, none of this is even called, which is important to know if you want to do something in the on initialized step, and you want to do maybe a transition for your modal or something like that. You're going to want to do that. You might want to do it slightly differently than what we're doing here, where you're creating this component on the fly. I'll show you maybe in just a second how we might do it differently. But just so we can kind of see these things happen, whoops. Let's go ahead and open the modal. And we saw all 3 of those happen at the same time. On initialized is first, as always, on parameter set, and then on after render. And the first time was set to true. Now, if we change this text box, we have 3, perhaps. We can see it got rendered again, which is a little bit odd to me that it gets rendered just by updating that. But I guess it makes sense, right? This text box was bound to a variable. So by changing this text box, the variable changed. And so then the component thinks it might need to re-render. In this case, it didn't need to, but I can see where, you know, it's kind of hard to tell that just by looking at the code or just by compiling the code whether or not it will need to change. So I can't fault them at all for that. But another thing I do want to point out is that the binding that this has doesn't actually take place until you tab out of this. Once I tab out of this, or exit out of it, it's going to switch to 2. And in fact, I'm not sure why we went back to the previous value there. Might have been maybe I hit something wrong. But okay. Anyways, now when we close this, and if we reopen this again, we'll notice that we have on initialized again, on parameters set again, and on after render again with the first time of true. So if you think about it, what really happened during that time, this component actually got completely destroyed, and we had to create a whole new one. And that's because of the way we were doing it in our code, where we have this if modal open, then you have the component, otherwise you don't. So that's because, we're just showing if it's open, and if it's not open, we're destroying it completely, which may be a good idea, may not. Let's go ahead and show you a different way that we could do this. If maybe we have a hidden parameter on this modal. So let's go ahead and add another parameter here. So we go parameter public bool hidden, and we're going to have a hidden attribute on the modal backdrop container, and it's going to be set to hidden. So if hidden is true, this attribute will exist. If it's false, it won't. And we can do it this way. So now back in the counter component, we could set hidden equal to not modal open. I don't know why I'm calling one of them open and one of them hidden, but you get the idea, right? So now this should work the same way, but let's look and see how it changes the life cycle of the component. So let's run this. All right, let's open this up and go to the console. And if you see here, we haven't even opened the modal yet, but we are initializing the parameters, or we're initializing the modal, we're setting the parameters, and we're rendering it, which is kind of interesting because it's hidden. But really, it is on the page. If I look and if I find it here, let's see. Here it is. It's right here, but it's hidden. So it's on the page. It's rendered, but because the hidden attribute puts a display none on it, then it's not shown. But it is on the page. So that's a difference than what we were doing before. So now when I open it, you'll see two new things happen. You'll see the onParameters set get called. So this is the first time we've seen onParameters set get called twice for the same modal, or for the same component. And that is because the hidden parameter got changed. So the parameter got changed, onParameters set gets called. Let's go back and see here. So we have on after render as well, and this time it renders, but the first time is set to false. So that makes sense. So these are two different ways of opening a modal, and you can see based off the component lifecycle the stages in which it goes in. Now if I close it, again we set the parameters, and again we rendered it, and we can just keep doing that. And we're never going to initialize that. So if you have something in your initialize step that you only want to have happened once, no matter how many times you open and close the modal, you might want to put it in there. Otherwise, if you want it to happen multiple times, or if you want your HTML to be nice and clean, you may want to just destroy that modal when you close it. It all depends on kind of what you're looking for. But I think hopefully that gives you a good sense of what these methods do. And again, let me just reiterate them just one more time. OnInitialized is going to get created, or going to get called when the component is first created. OnParameters set is going to get called after it's created and any subsequent times that parameters are set. And onAfterRender is going to get called the first time after the first component is rendered, and then it's going to get called every other time the component is rendered. So those are the main three that we're talking about when I'm talking about component life cycles. Now there was one more method. If we looked at the override, should render is the other one that we haven't really talked about yet. So let's go ahead and again, I don't know why it does that. All right. So this method basically tells the component whether or not it should render the component again. So let's go ahead and just return false and see what happens. Basically, we're saying we should never render this component. Okay, let's go ahead and run it. And we'll hit open modal, and you'll see that it's not opening. And that's because we did not render it more than once. So we did render it once though. So let's go ahead and see. We do have on after render for the first time. So should render always will not be taken into account when we first render the component. It's always going to get rendered at least once. The problem is the first time it was rendered, it was hidden. So there's no way for us to show it now that should render is set to false. No matter how many times our parameters get set to show this modal, it's not gonna re-render itself. So that's important to know. One other thing that you should notice about this though is that every time we click this, we're setting the hidden parameter to false, and yet the parameters, the onParameter set method keeps getting called, which is kind of counterintuitive to what you might think. You might think if the parameter stayed the same, why would it be getting set again? And it's a little bit vague as far as why that might be the case. You have, parameters are properties, so it's not necessarily going to be a standard get and set. There might be other things happening within there. So maybe that's the reasoning they went with that. But you could have a problem if, for example, in the onParameter set, you were doing something pretty heavy, like maybe you were doing an HTTP call or something like that. So let's go ahead and do it. Let's just go ahead and do that. HTTP client equals new HTTP client dot get string async, and we just need to make an API call to somewhere. I don't really know where yet. And let's change this to async task, and we'll use the async version of this function, and we'll await that, and maybe just print it out to the console. So I have to put something in there. Let's see what I want to put in there. Okay, I found this website that lets you do a dummy API call. So if you do a dummy API call here, you're going to get some JSON back. So that's what we'll get back from doing this call. So if let's say you only wanted to do this whenever the parameters were actually changing, you're going to have a problem as it stands right now, because we'll see why. All right, we got it once because that's when it was first rendered, or the parameters were first set, so that makes sense. However, now we're doing it every time. Let me clear this out again just so you can kind of see it. We're doing it every time the modal is supposedly opened, or the parameters are supposedly changed, even though the parameters really aren't changing. And that's something that I actually ran into on my own projects, where I thought the parameters weren't changing. And in fact, they were, because the parent component was re-rendering for some reason, and I was making a lot of extra API calls. So what you may want to do is you may want to have a private variable kind of keeping track of the previous state. Maybe call it previously hidden or something like that. We'll just default that to true because that's its initial state. And then you could say, if not hidden, but it previously was hidden, then you're going to do all this stuff. and then at the very end, you're going to just set previously hidden equal to hidden. And what that's going to do is it's going to basically say, okay, I'm only going to do this if this thing actually did change. Now, maybe there's a different way of doing this, and if you know of such a way, definitely let me know. I'd be very curious to know about that. But this is what I've used in my personal and professional projects. So now let's go ahead and run this again. All right, let's look at the console. So the first time it comes in, we have nothing, which actually makes sense because why would we do a HTTP? Why would we do the HTTP call if it hasn't even been opened? And that was this, right? It was previously. It is currently hidden, so we're not going to get in here, which is what we want. And if we hit open modal, now we're going to do the call. And if we clear this, if we do it, a bunch more times, we're not going to do that call anymore. So it's important to keep track of your parameters if this is a concern to you. If this is not a concern to you, if you're not doing any kind of heavy logic on the on-parameter set, then you don't need to really worry about this. But if you are, then you may need to worry about that. So just something to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to set should render back to what its default status is. And I'm actually going to get rid of this function. And let's get rid of the onInitialized function, because now I want to shift gears and talk about, actually, I'm going to keep this one. Let's shift gears and talk about JavaScript for a bit. So if you have some JavaScript, at what point can you use it? So if I'm going to inject JS runtime, and I'll probably do a separate video about using JavaScript. So if you aren't familiar with it, maybe keep your eyes out for that. But in essence, we're creating a JS runtime object, and we get to make a call into JavaScript from here. So let's go ahead and do JS runtime.invoke async, and that just takes a type. I'm just going to pass an object because I don't care what it is. And in here, I'm going to pass the name of the function that I want to invoke. So let's just go ahead and do find modal, and I got to make that function yet, but let's go ahead and put that there. Also, while I'm in here, I'm going to put an ID of counter modal, just because we're going to try to find that modal and do something with it. Okay, let's go make a JavaScript file. I'm going to call it main.js, and in here, we're going to call a function, shoot, what did I call that? Find modal. All right, find modal. So in here, I want to do, let's just let element, or let, I guess, modal equals document.getElementById, and that's going to be this counter modal. Okay, so if I want to, let's just say I want to see if the modal even exists. And if it doesn't, I'm going to alert out modal, I'll write it to the console. Console.log. Is it console.log? I think so. I'll just alert it. I can't remember for some reason. I'll just alert modal doesn't exist. And if it does exist, I want to see if it's hidden. So let's do let hidden equals modal.hasAttribute hidden. So if hidden, we'll say alert modal is hidden. And let's go ahead and capitalize that. Else alert modal is not hidden. And we'll see what one gets alerted here when we call this. Last thing we're going to do is put it in the actual HTML file. So let's go ahead and put it here. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and run it. And let's go to the, I clicked the counter thing. Let's go ahead and actually switch this. on the counter component here to only show it if modal open, just so we can see it a little bit clearer what it's doing. All right, I'm going to get rid of that hidden attribute for now. Just cleaning it up a little bit. Okay, sorry about that. Let's go ahead and try it again. All right, modal doesn't exist. So why doesn't it exist? It certainly is there. And the answer is because we were calling the JavaScript file before the component was rendered. Remember the steps. On initialized is first, on parameters set is second, on after render is third, but it happens after the component is rendered. So at this point, counter modal does not exist because we're doing it in the on initialized step. So if we change this to be in the on after render step, now it should exist. Let's go ahead and try that. And now it says modal is not hidden. So the modal is not hidden because it isn't hidden. It's up here. So it was able to tell what we were doing based off of how it would render, even though it hadn't actually shown it at that point. So keeping that in mind as far as when to call your JavaScripts, usually you're going to want to call them in the on after render. Perhaps you would call them on initialized if you were doing something like importing a JavaScript module. You might want to do that right away so that it's ready by the time it renders, or at least close to the time by the time it's rendered, something like that. So just keep that in mind as far as the component life cycles. You're going to want to do your JavaScript calls that rely on this component to be there after it's been rendered. So hopefully that makes sense. Last thing I want to cover is the iDisposable. So if you've done C# before, you're probably familiar with iDisposable, but if not, I'll just cover it real quick. So whenever you have resources that you want to get rid of after the object is out of use, you're going to want to dispose of it. So you could do something like using HTTP client equals new HTTP client, and HTTP client is one of those things that implements the iDisposable interface. If we look at this here, eventually we gotta keep going all the way down, but you'll see it implements iDisposable, and that's a special interface that is kind of known by the C# compiler, or maybe the .Net runtime. I don't know. One of them that is going to basically look for you to dispose of it when it gets when you're done with it. So by doing a using statement, it's going to automatically call client.dispose. Otherwise, you can just call client.dispose any other place, and it will get rid of it. So that type of thing is also in Blazor. So if you implement iDisposable, then you have to create a public void dispose, but then you can in here clean up whatever resources you were wanting to do. So let's go ahead and put console.writeLine, counter modal being disposed, and see if that actually gets called. Let's go ahead and run that. Okay, let's go ahead and look at this here. And you can see we got counter modal being disposed now in our console. So how this can be useful, especially is if you have, let's say you have something in your JavaScript that maybe you're subscribing a global listener to on the window. So maybe you're doing add event listener, and I'm actually going to copy and paste some code here because I don't remember the full extent of it. But maybe you're looking for something that happens before the unload step Maybe you want to say, changes have been made. Are you sure you want to leave? Type of a thing. You have to do that on the window, but maybe you only want to do that if the modal is open or something like that. So let's go ahead and actually put, I'm going to create another function here. Unload function. And instead of having a lambda function here, let's just put it in here. This has to be event. Okay. All right, so we can add event listener for before unload, and let's just test that and make sure that works. So if I open the modal, oh, I got all these alerts still happening. I'm just going to comment those out for now. Or just delete them, I guess. Let's go ahead and refresh that. So, maybe we've made some changes, and then we try to leave. I'm surprised that actually, why didn't that stop? Oh, okay. We have a typo. Let's try it again. Oops, has to be a number. Okay, so now let's say we try to leave. You get this leave site, changes you made may not be saved, which is great. That's what we want. But when the counter modal is disposed, you may want to, well, you do want to unsubscribe to that event. So let's go ahead and create another function here called unsubscribe. And we're going to remove that event listener. And now we can call that from the dispose function. Now, obviously, that doesn't make sense, right? Well, yeah, it does. It does make sense. So when we close the modal, we don't want this to happen anymore. So we're going to call unsubscribe. Okay, let's try that. Oh, I keep getting these pop-ups. Okay, so if I look in here, let's just go ahead and set some breakpoints, perhaps. All right, so I open the modal. We're subscribing to it here. And then I try to leave, and we unsubscribe here. And now if I try to leave the page, I don't get that pop-up anymore. So especially if you're using global listeners on something that was called from your component, you probably do want to put some dispose logic in there to unsubscribe to that, as well as any other objects that you have that are doing some heavy lifting. Especially from Blazor server, you might want to dispose of like a SQL client or something like that. But yeah, so we covered on initialized, on parameters set, on after render, should render, dispose, and the timing of when you would want to call JavaScript with your steps here. So hopefully this was informative. Let me know if you have any questions on it, and let me know if you have any other Blazor topics you want me to cover. I think next time we're going to go probably a little bit deeper dive into JavaScript and how you can pass objects back and forth between JavaScript and Blazor. So I think that's it. Hope you enjoyed it.